The whip cracked in the hot desert air, but it did not touch flesh. Not yet. The black Mare screamed. Her voice was not the sound of an animal. It was the sound of betrayal, of pain, of a creature who had trusted humans and learned too late that trust was a mistake. She reared backward, her front hooves nearly striking the wooden post where she was tied, and every single person standing in the dusty town square of Redemption Valley stopped moving. The horse was bleeding already, not from the whip, from the metal bit jammed so deep into her mouth that her own teeth had cut her gums. Blood dripped down her chin and mixed with sweat and dirt. Her eyes were rolling white with terror. The man holding the whip was named Marcus Holt. He was tall and thin, with a face like dried leather and a smile that showed teeth the color of old bones. He wore a black hat and black clothes, even in the burning heat of the afternoon. His right arm was raised, the whip coiled above his head, ready to strike again. And he was staring at the Mare with eyes that held no mercy, no understanding, no humanity. "This Mare," Marcus said loudly, speaking so that the entire crowd could hear him, "cost me $100. She ate my hay. She drank my water. And yesterday, she threw my son off her back, broke his arm. A valuable horse does not throw a Holt from her back and live to do it again." The crowd did not cheer. But they did not stop him either. The Mare's name was Shadow. She was 7 years old. Her black coat had once been so shiny that it reflected the sunlight like water. Her legs were strong. Her chest was deep and powerful. She had been born wild on the desert plains north of Redemption Valley, and for 5 years she had run free with her herd, knowing only grass and sunshine and the company of her own kind. Then the capture came. Cowboys had rounded up her entire family, ropes and horses and dust and screaming. Shadow had run until her legs burned, but there were too many of them. A rope loop had caught her neck. She had fallen hard to the ground. Men had jumped on her, had tied her legs, had thrown a saddle on her back before she could even breathe properly. 3 months ago, she had been sold to Marcus Holt. Those 3 months had been the worst of her life. The sun was directly overhead now, burning down without mercy on the small desert town. The thermometer nailed to the side of the saloon read 103 degrees. The sand on the ground was so hot that it would burn the skin off a man's foot if he stood in one spot too long. The buildings cast sharp black shadows on the earth. The sky was so bright and so blue that it hurt to look at it. Everything in Redemption Valley was brown or red or white. Adobe buildings, wooden posts, cloth torn by wind and sun. The only living things that seemed to matter were the horses. The humans were just the background, the audience for something that was about to happen. Shadow's sides heaved in and out as she struggled to breathe. Her front left leg had a deep cut on it. Her mane was matted with blood and sweat. Foam dripped from her mouth where the bit cut into the soft skin. But it was her eyes that told the real story. Those eyes held intelligence. Those eyes held memory. Those eyes remembered freedom. And those eyes were slowly filling with the knowledge that she would never be free again. Marcus pulled the rope tighter, wrapping it twice around the wooden post. Then he stepped back. He let the whip uncoil completely. It was a long whip, maybe 8 feet long, with a handle of dark leather and strands of thin rope braided together. The end was knotted, designed to cut and tear. "When a horse defies a Holt," Marcus announced to the crowd, "the horse learns that defiance brings pain, every single time." He raised his arm higher. The sun caught the whip and made it shine like silver for just a moment. But that was the moment when someone stepped out of the crowd. It was a young man, maybe 25 years old. He wore the clothes of a ranch hand-faded shirt, worn leather chaps, a hat dusted with miles of riding. But his face was different from the other men in Redemption Valley. His eyes were different. They held something that most men in that town had lost a long time ago. They held choice. "Mr. Holt," the young man said, his voice calm but steady. "That's enough." The entire crowd went silent. The wind stopped blowing. Even the heat seemed to pause. Marcus turned slowly. His smile grew wider. "Did you just speak to me, boy?" That Mare is scared, the young man continued, walking forward through the crowd. His name was Thomas Webb, and he was the grandson of the original founder of Redemption Valley. He had been away for 5 years, studying animals and horsemanship in the Northern Territories. He had only returned to his family home 3 days ago. She's not angry, she's terrified. A scared animal cannot be blamed for defending herself. She is my property, Marcus said, his voice turning cold and sharp like ice. I paid money for her. I feed her. That gives me the right to do anything I want with her. No, Thomas said simply. He was standing directly in front of Shadow now, between her and the whip. That's not how it works. That's never how it works. Marcus stepped forward. He raised the whip again. You want to take her place, boy? I can arrange that. But Thomas did not move. He stood still and calm, looking directly into Marcus Holt's eyes. And for the first time, the crowd saw something that made their breath catch. Shadow stepped forward, not backward. Not away, forward. She moved her head down slightly. The terror in her eyes was still there, but something else had entered them too. Hope that it was a small thing. It was just a movement. But in that moment, in front of the entire town of Redemption Valley, under the burning sun, with a whip raised and ready to strike, everything changed. Someone in the crowd was filming. Nobody knew it yet. Nobody knew that this moment would travel across the world, that it would prove that injustice could be witnessed, that it would show that one person, standing still and quiet, could matter more than a man with a whip and anger in his heart. But it was happening anyway. The whip trembled in Marcus Holt's hand.
Marcus Holt's hand shook, not from fear, from rage. The whip trembled in his grip like a living snake. His face turned dark red. The blood in his neck stood out like thick ropes. He was a man who was not used to being challenged. He was a man who had hurt animals and people his entire life and had never faced consequences. Now, in front of the entire town, a young man, a boy really, was standing between him and what he wanted. "Move," Marcus said. His voice was low and dangerous. "Move right now, or I will cut you down where you stand." Thomas Webb did not move. His feet were firmly planted in the dust. His hands were open and empty, showing he had no weapon. But his eyes were steady and clear and full of something Marcus Holt did not understand. "No," Thomas said simply. "I won't move." The crowd gasped. This was not how things worked in Redemption Valley. When Marcus Holt gave an order, people obeyed. When Marcus Holt wanted something, he took it. Nobody defied him. Nobody had ever had the courage or the foolishness to stand in his way. Shadow felt the change. The energy in the air was different now. The human in front of her was calm. He was not running away. He was not attacking. He was simply standing with her, for her. Marcus raised the whip higher. His arm went back. The entire crowd held its breath. This was the moment when violence would happen. This was the moment when someone would bleed. And then, the gunshot cracked across the town square like thunder. Everyone jumped. The bullet hit the wooden post next to Marcus's head. The impact was so close that splinters of wood exploded into his face. He screamed and dropped the whip, his hands flying up to cover his eyes. Sheriff Coleman rode into the square on his brown horse, his gun still smoking in his hand. He was 60 years old, with gray hair and a weathered face that had seen everything in 30 years of law enforcement. He was also the man who had raised Thomas Webb from the age of 10, after Thomas's parents had died of fever. "Marcus Holt," the sheriff said, his voice calm and official. "You are under arrest for animal cruelty and attempted assault." The crowd erupted. People started talking at once. Some looked shocked. Some looked relieved. Some looked angry. Marcus was bleeding from the splinters in his face. He was screaming, "You can't arrest me. This is my property. This horse is mine. I can do whatever I want with my own property." "No, you can't," the sheriff said simply. He dismounted his horse with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times. He pulled handcuffs from his belt. "The law of this land says that animals have the right to be treated with basic kindness. Starving a horse, tying her up, beating her with a whip. That's all against the law. That's been the law for 3 years. You were just never caught before." As the sheriff walked toward Marcus, Thomas stepped away from Shadow. He did not speak. He did not make any sudden movements. He simply walked backward, step by step, until he reached the mare's head. Shadow was still terrified. Her body was still shaking, but she did not rear or attack. She lowered her head slightly, and Thomas placed his hand on her forehead. "It's okay," he whispered. "It's okay now. You're safe." The truth came out over the next hour. The sheriff had received an anonymous letter, written in careful handwriting, describing the abuse of a black mare on Marcus Holt's ranch. The letter had mentioned the date and time when the beating would happen. The sheriff had ridden to town quickly, arriving just in time to stop the whip. But there was more. Thomas had written the letter. He had arrived in Redemption Valley 3 days earlier and had immediately started visiting the ranches and farms in the area, checking on the animals. It was something he had learned to do in his years away, to look for suffering, to document it, to report it. When he saw Shadow, he knew immediately what was happening. He had written the letter the same day. "I couldn't just watch," Thomas told the sheriff quietly, standing away from the crowd. "I couldn't just stand there and let it happen. I had to try. Even if it didn't work, I had to try." The sheriff put a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You did good, boy. You did real good." But the most important discovery came when the veterinarian, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chun, arrived to examine Shadow. Dr. Chun had traveled from the town of Silver Ridge, an hour's ride away. She was one of the few trained animal doctors in the entire region. She worked carefully, gently, checking Shadow's mouth and her legs and her ribs. When she was done, she pulled Thomas aside. "This horse," Dr. Chun said, her voice filled with something like wonder, "is worth a lot of money. She's a purebred Arabian. Her bloodline is traced back to the royal families of the Middle East. She's not just any horse. She's exceptional." Thomas looked at Shadow with new eyes. Exceptional. Of course she was. Anyone could see it if they looked carefully. The way she moved, the strength in her legs, the intelligence in her eyes. Marcus Holt paid $100 for her. Thomas asked. He either didn't know what she was, Dr. Chun said, or he knew and didn't care. Either way, he wasted a fortune, and he damaged her badly. She'll recover, but she'll carry scars from this. Physical scars and mental ones. News spread across Redemption Valley quickly. By sunset, everyone knew. Marcus Holt had arrested. A young horse had been saved. A mystery person had written a letter that changed everything. Sheriff Coleman had risked a bullet to stop the beating. And everyone knew who had written the letter. Thomas Webb's name was on people's lips. Some spoke it with respect. Some spoke it with fear. Fear of a man who would challenge the old ways. As the sun went down and the sky turned orange and red and purple, Thomas stood alone with Shadow. The mare had been moved to the town's public stable, a clean place with good hay and fresh water. Her wounds had been cleaned and dressed. She stood quietly in a stall, eating for the first time in days without fear. Thomas leaned against the fence and watched her. "You're going to be okay," he said softly. "I promise. You're going to be okay." Shadow turned her head and looked at him, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not words, not language, but understanding. The mare understood that this human was different. This human had stood still and quiet and had saved her life. The blacksmith walked by and stopped. "That's quite a horse," he said. "Yes," Thomas agreed. She worth a lot of money." "Yes." "What are you going to do with her?" Thomas smiled. It was a sad smile, but also a determined one. "I'm going to teach her that humans can be trusted again, even after everything, even after the whip and the pain. I'm going to teach her that kindness exists." The blacksmith nodded and walked away, and Shadow ate her hay, slowly and carefully, while the young man who had saved her life stood guard through the gathering darkness. Everything had changed. The old way of doing things, hurting animals without consequence, was ending, and a new way was beginning. The whip came down, but did not strike Shadow. Thomas Webb's arm shot up and caught the leather rope in his bare hand. The whip wrapped around his forearm, burning his skin instantly. He did not cry out. He did not let go. His eyes stayed locked on Marcus Holt's face with a calmness that terrified the older man more than any weapon could have. "I told you," Thomas said, his voice quiet but hard as stone. "That is enough." Marcus yanked backward, trying to pull the whip free. But Thomas held firm. The crowd gasped. Some people covered their mouths. This was not something that happened in Redemption Valley. Nobody challenged Marcus Holt. Nobody stood against him. Holt was a man with money and power, and no one to stop him. But Thomas Webb was not from Redemption Valley anymore. He pulled the whip away from Marcus and threw it into the dust. Then he reached up and carefully, slowly, began to untie Shadow from the post. The rope came free in his hands. The mare was trembling so badly that she could barely stand, but she did not run. She stood next to Thomas and breathed. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Marcus hissed. His face had turned purple with rage. Veins stood out on his neck like dark ropes. "You're on my ranch. This is my town. I will. You will do nothing," came a new voice. The crowd parted. Sheriff Daniel Cross rode into the town square on a gray horse, dust rising behind him. He was an old man, maybe 65, with a silver badge and kind eyes that had seen too much. Behind him rode 2 deputies. They were young, but they wore the authority of the law on their faces like masks. "Mr. Holt," the sheriff said, sliding down from his horse. "I got a telegram about an hour ago from the horse auction in the north. They said you sold them a stolen mare last month. A mare that belonged to the Wild Creek Ranch. A mare that was registered and documented with the Territorial Records Office." Marcus's face changed. The purple anger drained away, leaving him pale and gray like old bone. "That's a lie," he said, but his voice had lost its strength. "I bought that mare fair and legal." "No," a woman's voice called out. The crowd turned. A woman was pushing her way through. She was maybe 40 years old, dressed in worn ranch clothes, with dirt on her boots and strength in her shoulders. Her name was Elizabeth Summers, and she owned the Wild Creek Ranch, one of the biggest horse operations in the entire territory. "That mare is mine," Elizabeth said, pointing at Shadow. "She was stolen from my ranch 7 months ago. I have papers. I have witnesses. I have her mother's bloodline documented with the Territorial Board. She is worth $300, not $100. I didn't steal anything," Marcus said, but now the lie was clear in every word. Sheriff Cross stepped forward. He was not angry. He was just tired. "Mr. Holt, you are under arrest for theft, fraud, and animal cruelty. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to a fair trial in front of a judge in the county seat. Anything you say—" "I want a lawyer," Marcus spat. The deputies moved forward and took his arms. They were not rough, but they were firm. Marcus Holt was led away from the town square. His black hat fell off in the dust, and nobody picked it up. Nobody moved to help him. The man who had seemed so powerful just moments before was suddenly small and ordinary and just another criminal. But the real change was happening somewhere else entirely. Shadow had collapsed to her knees the moment the rope came off. Thomas knelt beside her, his burned hand forgotten, and spoke softly against her neck. "You're safe now. You're really safe. I promise you." Elizabeth Summers walked over slowly. She did not rush. She did not reach out aggressively. She simply stood there and let Shadow see her. The mare's eyes found the woman's face and held it. For a long moment, there was complete silence in the entire town square. Then Shadow stood up. She stood on shaky legs. She swayed slightly, but she stood, and she walked toward Elizabeth Summers, and she lowered her head, and she pressed her forehead against the woman's chest. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "Hello, Shadow," she whispered. "I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped trying to find you. I'm so sorry I took so long." The crowd began to understand something in that moment. This was not just about a horse being beaten. This was about a creature that had been stolen from people who loved her. This was about a mother's grief and a child's loss transformed into this moment of reunion. Sheriff Cross stood beside Thomas Webb and watched in silence. "You knew," the sheriff said quietly. "I suspected," Thomas replied. "I saw the registration papers on Marcus's desk last week when I was paying him for some supplies. The date was wrong. The handwriting was not his. I sent a telegram to Wild Creek Ranch. Elizabeth sent back confirmation this morning. I wanted to wait for her to arrive, but I couldn't just watch him hit her. I couldn't just stand there." "You did good," the sheriff said. "You did real good, but the best part was still coming. Word began to spread through Redemption Valley like wildfire. A stolen horse, an arrest, a woman reunited with a lost animal. By evening, people were telling the story on every corner. By the next morning, it was spreading to neighboring towns. And by the end of the week, someone who had been filming with a camera from the roof of the saloon, someone the crowd had not even noticed, had sent the pictures and the story to a newspaper in the capital city. The story read, "Justice in the desert. Sheriff stops animal cruelty, arrests thief, reunites horse with rightful owner." The photograph showed Thomas Webb standing beside Shadow while the sheriff placed handcuffs on Marcus Holt. The photograph showed a crowd watching. The photograph showed a black mare with her forehead against the chest of a woman who loved her. That night, Shadow slept in a clean stable at Wild Creek Ranch. Her wounds were being treated by a skilled veterinarian. Her water was fresh and cold. Her hay was sweet, and Elizabeth Summers sat in the stall beside her, sometimes sleeping, sometimes just watching the mare breathe and live and survive. Thomas Webb received a letter 3 days later. It was an invitation. Elizabeth Summers wanted to hire him to work at a ranch. She wanted him to help her train horses. She wanted him to help her find stolen animals. She wanted him to continue doing what he had done in the town square. She wanted him to stand up against injustice. He accepted immediately, and Marcus Holt faced trial 2 weeks later. The judge found him guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for theft and animal cruelty. On his last day in Redemption Valley, as they took him away, he was forced to walk past Shadow one final time. The mare did not flinch. She simply watched him go with eyes that held no fear anymore. Because Shadow had learned something important. She had learned that humans could choose to be kind. The investigation did not stop with Marcus Holt's arrest. It only began. Sheriff Cross sat in his office on the morning after the arrest, looking at a pile of papers that grew higher every hour. Thomas Webb sat across from him, still wearing bandages on the arm that had caught the whip. Elizabeth Summers stood by the window, watching the street below, and Deputy Miller was riding through the territory, knocking on ranch doors, asking questions that opened doors nobody wanted opened. "There are 16 horses," Elizabeth said quietly, without looking up from the window. 16 that I can confirm came from other ranches in the last 2 years. 16 that Marcus Holt sold as his own property. That we know about, Sheriff Cross added, rubbing his tired eyes. There could be more. The telegram had been sent to neighboring territories, to sheriffs in other counties, to the Territorial Horse Registration Office. And the responses that came back were worse than anyone had imagined. A rancher in the eastern county had lost 3 horses. A woman in the south had lost 2. An old man who had died the year before had had his entire herd stolen. His son only found out when he tried to sell the ranch and discovered the horses were registered in other people's names. The trail of theft led backward through time like a dark river, and Marcus Holt had been swimming in it for years. But there was something else, something darker. Deputy Miller returned to the office late on the second day. He was dusty and tired, but his face was serious. He placed a leather journal on Sheriff Cross's desk. "Found this in the back room of Holt's barn," Miller said. "Behind some hay. It's his record book." Sheriff Cross opened it slowly. Each page was filled with dates and names and numbers. Not just horses. Animals that Marcus had bought from desperate people. People who needed money and would sell anything. People who had no choice. Foals taken from their mothers too early. Horses beaten until they would obey. Prices marked down to 50 cents on the dollar. Then sold for triple the price to people who did not ask questions. And there were names. Names of the people who had sold the stolen animals. Names of the people who had bought them. Names of the people who knew what was happening and said nothing. The entire system was written down in that little black book. One name appeared more than any other: Deputy William Holt. Marcus's brother. William had been working in the sheriff's office for 3 years. He had written down where horses would be traveling. He had told Marcus which ranches were vulnerable. He had looked the other way every single time someone came in to report a missing horse. "Where is he?" Thomas asked, standing up so quickly his chair fell backward. "We arrested him 2 hours ago," Sheriff Cross said quietly. "He confessed to everything. Said Marcus forced him. Said he was scared of his brother. "That is a lie," Elizabeth said, still looking out the window. "I have heard them together. I have heard them laugh about people they stole from. William is just as guilty as Marcus." The town of Redemption Valley began to wake up on that second day. People started remembering a horse that had disappeared 5 years ago, another that had been sold to Marcus suddenly, only to vanish weeks later, a woman's prize mare that was supposed to be retired to have babies, but had been stolen before she even reached the ranch. Stories that had been accepted quietly now seemed like crimes. Stories that seemed isolated now seemed like part of a pattern. And the pattern was being pulled apart, thread by thread, lie by lie. By the fourth day, Thomas Webb had visited 16 ranches with Sheriff Cross. At each one, they found more evidence. A horse with markings that did not match the papers. A young colt that was clearly from a champion bloodline, but had been sold for nothing. An old mare with scars shaped like Holt's brand hidden under years of hair growth. Each rancher's face showed the same thing: betrayal. They had been robbed. They had been tricked. They had been made to look foolish by a man who knew how to lie and how to make other people lie with him. But something else began to happen, too. The ranchers started talking to each other. They started comparing stories. They formed a group, the Coalition for Honest Trading, they called themselves. They hired a lawyer from the capital city. They began to demand justice, not just for horses, but for the entire system that had allowed Marcus Holt to operate for so long. The lawyer was a woman named Sarah Morton. She was young and fierce, and had no patience for corruption. She filed documents with the territorial judge. She demanded a trial. She demanded that all the ranchers be allowed to testify. She demanded that the full extent of the crimes be exposed in open court so that everyone would know the truth. And slowly, the entire town began to understand something that they had been avoiding for a very long time. They had let this happen, not actively, not on purpose, but through silence, through looking the other way, through accepting easy answers and not asking hard questions. They had allowed a criminal to operate in their town because it was easier than confronting him. Elizabeth Summers called a town meeting. More than 100 people gathered in the town hall on the evening of the 5th day. Elizabeth stood up and spoke first. She talked about shadow, but she talked about more than that. She talked about responsibility. She talked about the moment when you see something wrong and you choose to do nothing. She talked about what happens when good people stay silent. "I'm just as guilty as anyone," she said, her voice steady but sad. "I knew something was wrong with Marcus Holt. I heard stories, but I did not investigate. I did not ask questions. I accepted what he told me because it was easier, and because I did nothing, more horses suffered." Thomas Webb stood up next. He told the story of Shadow, how she had been stolen from people who loved her, how she had been beaten by a man who saw her as nothing more than a thing to own, how she had been saved by one person choosing to stand up. "That person was me," he said, "but I was just one person. I had to be supported by the sheriff. I had to be supported by Elizabeth. I had to be supported by a lawyer willing to fight. And I had to be supported by all of you by deciding that you would not accept this anymore." The vote came at midnight. The town voted unanimously to support the prosecution of Marcus Holt and his brother William. They voted to establish new laws for the protection of animals. They voted to create a registry office where all horse sales would have to be documented and verified. They voted to make Redemption Valley a place where theft and cruelty would not be tolerated. The vote was not celebrated, but it was serious. It was necessary. It was the sound of a community deciding to change. 2 weeks later, Marcus Holt and his brother William sat in the county courthouse. The trial was not dramatic. It was methodical. Evidence after evidence. Witness after witness. The leather journal. The registration papers. The testimony of ranchers whose lives had been disrupted by theft and lies. The judge listened carefully to everything. On the last day, before the verdict, the judge asked Marcus Holt if he had anything to say. Marcus stood up. He looked around the courtroom. He saw the faces of the people he had stolen from. He saw Shadow, who had been brought to the courthouse by Elizabeth, a living reminder of his crimes. "I don't care," he said quietly. "I don't care what any of you think." But his hands were trembling. The judge sentenced him to 7 years in prison. His brother William to 5 years. The verdict was read in the afternoon, and by evening, the news was spreading across the territory. Justice had come to Redemption Valley. A system of corruption had been broken. A community had stood up, and it had started with one person saying no. 1 year later, Shadow stood in a meadow full of green grass that stretched all the way to the mountains. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and red and gold. The wind moved through her black coat, which now shone like polished stone. Her legs were strong. Her eyes were bright. Her breathing was deep and easy. She was alive in a way she had never been alive before. Elizabeth Summers stood at the fence, watching the mare graze. Beside her was Thomas Webb, now the head trainer at Wild Creek Ranch. They did not speak. There was no need for words. They were just witnessing something that had seemed impossible a year ago, a horse that had been broken finding her way back to wholeness. "She's perfect," Thomas said finally, his voice soft. "She's more than perfect," Elizabeth replied. "She's proof." Proof of what? She did not need to explain. The scars on Shadow's body had faded, but never completely disappeared. There was a thin line where the metal bit had cut her gums. It would never fully heal. Her left front leg was slightly shorter than it should be because of the injury from Marcus Holt's ranch. When she ran, she moved with a slight limp that would never go away. She would never race. She would never perform in shows. She would never be a champion horse in the way that the world measured such things. But Shadow had learned something that most horses never learned: survival. Not just physical survival, but the survival of trust. And that made her more valuable than any champion. Elizabeth had begun to use Shadow in a new program. She called it the Second Chance Healing Program. It was simple but powerful. Horses that had been abused, neglected, or stolen were brought to Wild Creek Ranch. They were given food and water and safety. But more importantly, they were given time with Shadow. People who had been traumatized by cruelty could see that Shadow had been traumatized too. They could watch how she gradually learned to trust again. They could see her scars and understand that a body could heal even when it was broken. They could watch her move carefully through the meadow and understand that survival was possible. And it changed them. A young boy whose father had beaten him came to the ranch. He watched Shadow for 3 months. He started to help care for her. He brushed her coat. He brought her water. And one day, he finally cried. Not tears of despair, but tears of understanding. If Shadow could survive and still be beautiful, maybe he could too. An old man who had lost everything in a fire came to the ranch. He had stopped believing that good things existed in the world. He spent his days sitting by Shadow's stall. He did not talk. He did not explain. He just sat and watched the mare breathe. And after 6 weeks, he began to smile again. A woman who had been kidnapped and held prisoner came to the ranch. She could not trust anyone. She could barely trust herself. But she could trust Shadow because Shadow had been trapped too. And slowly, week by week, she learned that freedom was not just about being released. It was about choosing to live again. Redemption Valley had changed in ways that went far beyond horses. The new registry laws that had been passed became a model for other territories. Horse owners in 5 different counties adopted the same system. The Coalition for Honest Trading became a permanent organization that investigated suspected crimes and helped ranchers protect their property. They also became advocates for animal welfare laws. Deputy William Holt's position remained empty for 4 months before being filled by a new officer, a young woman named Maria Delgado who had training in animal investigation. She was fierce and honest and had zero tolerance for corruption. Within her first month, she had investigated 3 suspected cases of horse theft and recovered all the animals. Sheriff Cross retired at the end of the year. He said he had seen enough to know that the town was going to be all right. Thomas Webb was offered his position, but he turned it down. He wanted to work with horses, not paperwork. Instead, Maria Delgado was promoted to sheriff. Elizabeth Summers became known throughout the territory as the woman who had transformed her ranch into a place of healing. People came from hundreds of miles away. Some stayed for weeks. Some came back year after year. They came to be near Shadow. They came to understand that survival was possible. They came to heal. On the anniversary of Marcus Holt's arrest, the town of Redemption Valley held a celebration. It was not called that officially. They called it Community Day, but everyone knew what it really was. A day to remember how far they had come. A day to honor the change that had begun with one person saying no. Shadow was there. She walked through the town square where, exactly 1 year before, she had stood terrified while a man raised a whip. Now she walked with Elizabeth, calm and peaceful. Children came up and touched her coat. Adults told their children the story of how a black mare had changed everything. Thomas Webb gave a speech in front of 100 people. He talked about courage and standing up for what is right. He talked about how one action can create ripples that change an entire community. He talked about Shadow and what she had taught them all. That mare was broken, he said, his hand resting on Shadow's neck. She was beaten and stolen and left to die. But she survived, and in surviving, she showed us something. She showed us that we are stronger than our pain, that we can choose to trust again, that we can choose to be kind. Shadow did not have to come to Wild Creek Ranch and help other people heal. She did not have to stand in this town square and face the people and the place that hurt her. But she did. And because she did, hundreds of people have been able to heal too. The crowd was silent. Many were crying. That night, back at the ranch, Shadow stood in her stall. It was clean and warm and safe. Outside, stars filled the entire sky. The desert was quiet except for the sound of wind and night creatures. Elizabeth came in and sat beside the mare. "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered. "Thank you for surviving. Thank you for teaching us that survival means more than just staying alive. It means choosing to be strong. It means choosing to be kind. It means choosing to help others." Shadow rested her head against Elizabeth's shoulder. The newspaper in the capital city published a final story about Redemption Valley. The headline read, "The Mare Who Changed a Town. How One Horse Exposed Corruption and Built Community." The article told the story. It told about Marcus Holt and his brother. It told about the stolen horses and the investigation. It told about the community that had awakened. And it told about Shadow, a black mare who had been beaten and broken and left to die, and who had instead become a symbol of survival and healing. But the most powerful part of the article came at the very end. It was a quote from Thomas Webb. Shadow never ran races. She never won competitions. She never became a champion in the way the world measures such things. But she became something more important. She became proof that broken things can heal, that trapped things can be freed, that survival is always possible, and that when we choose to stand up for what is right, we create change that echoes through generations. And in a quiet meadow surrounded by mountains, a black mare with a slight limp and permanent scars continued to teach people what survival really meant. She taught that healing is not about forgetting pain. It's about choosing to move forward anyway. She taught that scars are not signs of weakness. They're proof that you survived. She taught that the worst moment of your life does not have to be the last moment of your life. She taught that one person, standing firm and refusing to look away, can change everything. Shadow never spoke. She never needed to. Her life was the message. And the message reached across the desert and into the hearts of everyone who had ever been broken and wondered if they could be put back together again. They could. Shadow proved it.